Hello, everyone. We'll just give it a few more minutes for some of the other folks to join. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Emily Bertrand, the Director of Product Marketing here at AxZero. I'll be moderating the conversation with our expert panelists today as we dive into our 2022 cybersecurity predictions and 2021 year in review, where we'll be discussing the incidents, technologies, and regulatory directives that helped shape the last 12 months. As well, we'll be getting into our predictions for the year ahead and how small and mid-sized businesses can proactively prepare for what's to come. First, here's a quick rundown of how we'll spend the next 55 minutes or so. I'll start by introducing our speakers, followed by a quick look back at our 2021 predictions and whether or not we saw them come to light or not. Then we'll spend the majority of our time talking through what the panelists believe the year ahead will bring us and how businesses can prepare. We've got some supporting resources we'll share that you can dive into after the call. And of course, we've carved out some time for Q&A at the end. With that, quick housekeeping note before we get started. For those audience members joining us live today, if you do have questions, please submit them at any point via the question space on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. And if not, we'll follow up after the session. All right, so I am pleased to introduce our three expert panelists that will be speaking today. First, we have Jennifer Mitchell, who is our head of operations here at AxZero. She brings over 10 years of experience in IT services and currently runs our SOC, leading our threat hunting team. She's passionate about driving towards operational efficiency and has helped to develop our DR strategy here. Welcome, Jen. Next up, we have Adam Mansour, our vCISO at AxZero. He brings a wealth of experience with over 15 years of experience in the cybersecurity space, focused across endpoint, network, and cloud system security. Other areas of expertise he's focused on include audits and architecture and building and managing SOCs. He's an ethical hacker and also the creator of the Intelligo MDR platform, which AxZero acquired back in 2019. Welcome, Adam. And last but certainly not least, we have our distinguished security engineer, Sean Hiddle. He spent over 20 years in new concept protection engine design with a focus on IPS, firewall, sandbox, CASB, and IAS security. He's been working with AI and ML since the 90s. And while at Netscope and Symantec, Sean has reverse engineered every major ransomware strain from 2006 to 2018. We're glad that you could join us today, Sean. Thanks. All right, so as organizations move toward the rest of the year and start planning for 2022, it's helpful to take a look back and learn from key cybersecurity incidents that have really shaped the past 12 months. Maybe some of you were on the call last year, but at the end of 2020, we hosted a similar webinar, then laid out predictions for the year ahead. At that time, new threats and tactics were par for the course, but we were also seeing a continuous and dramatic change in the attack surface as organizations around the globe settled into the new reality that we're still living in of a distributed workforce. Many things were in flux, and with that in mind, our panelists each laid out 2 predictions of where 2021 was going to take us. I'm going to hand it over to the experts to walk you through whether their predictions were either a hit or a miss. Adam, let's start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the predictions were grounded, at least mine, in a continuation of where IT and risk was at the height of the pandemic in 2020, and that things like remote work, a rise in ransomware, meant that a lot of focus was going to be on the endpoint. Right now, your entire data center security got to be packed into some of these remote workstations, and while you may not have been ready for it, in 2020, certainly in 2021. We figured that a lot of companies, would focus on this, and so would attackers. And we were right. We saw, 4,000% increase in things like ransomware attacks. That a lot of, remote assets were starting to get a lot more focus, from zero trust to, next gen AV and cloud enabled detections and things like that. And so, this was a hit. One of the things that was a miss was that we figured, as the momentum of things like GDPR in the EU and UK and CCPA in California, NYDFS in New York, were starting to put a lot of regulatory fines behind privacy regulation. Unfortunately, we didn't have a hit here. It was a miss. We figured that more states would have adopted a privacy regulation, either of their own. There'd be a federal one, Bill C-11, at least in Canada, which is its second reading in Parliament, so we're still waiting on it, but it hasn't come into force yet in 2021. And so this and other regulatory bodies have certainly slowed. It's a bit more chaos than we would have liked, maybe refactoring some of their standards. But there was another prediction that came true that was wrong 2 years ago, so we were a little late on it, about hypervisors getting hacked in the cloud, which we saw a couple weeks ago. So even though I was at 50%, I feel like there was still one that I got right eventually. So.
We'll give you that one. You bring a strong case. Thanks, Adam. Jen, I hosted this last year, so I do remember your bold prediction that the traditional SOC is dead. Was this a hit or a miss? And then you can get right into your second prediction around businesses being less tolerant of alert fatigue and false positives.
Yeah, both hits. What was interesting about the traditional SOC is dead one is that while the lockdowns were originally a forcing factor, right, in this distributed workplace, and we saw a lot of SOCs having to disband and work from home, what it actually did over time when those lockdowns then continued was that these companies who viewed this originally as a temporary measure were kind of forced to make it permanent, or chose to make it permanent. And so what that really did was solidify this different way of working in a lot of security operations center, and the realization by a lot of the leaders of these SOCs that we could do something different, and that the traditional way of running a security operations center was not the only way. So I think that was definitely a hit. We see a lot less emphasis on those traditional structures over this year than we have seen in previous years. In terms of alert fatigue, false positives, that hit as well. We've actually seen this unfold across two things. So maybe where Adam is claiming his 2/3, I might claim 200% on this one. So first, we saw it across our existing customer base. We definitely saw increased engagement from customers when, the less alerts we were sending them overall and more meaningful alerts. We saw increased engagement on individual events and wanting to work with us on, normalizing behavior in their environment and whatever else we could do to continue to decrease the overall number of alerts and make the alerts that we surface them to be a lot more valuable. And so we saw a definite hit there. But what we also saw is in our prospecting. So we are getting a lot of signal from our prospects that as they're assessing security vendors, that this is a major headliner for them. So this, improved signal to noise ratio of their alerts. And we're seeing it from prospects, and in some cases, even table stakes, right? So we saw a hit on that across two fronts this year.
Thanks, Jen. I definitely know that was a hit. Signal to noise ratio is something we talk a lot about at Axero, and has been at the forefront of a lot of the conversations we've had with customers over the past year. And I think separate from inaccurate alerts obviously being noisy, they're also incredibly expensive. One of the metrics that we throw around a lot is that with an average of 500 alerts a day and 81% being false positives, companies could be spending 13.5 hours a day on unreliable alerts. So more time than any of us have, or our teams have. All right, we'll wrap up our year in review with Sean. At the end of last year, you predicted that protecting the cloud will leave many security technologies largely inapplicable, and that hackers will leverage new extortion tactics. Can you talk through these?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I see both of these to be hits for sure. So, on the cloud security, or cloud leaving many traditional security products largely inapplicable. Traditional security products generally take the protect the endpoint asset strategy, and they've continued to do so. I mean, this is generally done through a combination of like endpoint and network sensors. These generally either don't work at all or have greatly reduced functionality in the cloud, and this has just kind of continued over the last year. When somebody's on a cloud migration journey, typically too often the administrators are far too focused on implementation aspects associated with whatever app they're trying to get up into the cloud. And they're largely forgetting about the security aspects. That's even if the security technologies that they had in the on-prem solution actually worked in the cloud. But with the cloud, there's so many other aspects that have to do with the configuration of the base hardware that they need to run. So the second one is hackers leveraging new extortion tactics. In 2021, we saw the extortion tactic amplification in spades. Formerly, extortion was based entirely upon encrypting files and extorting the victim to be able to pay a ransom to get the files back in a decrypted form. But we saw first double extortion where the victim was extorted for their files being exfiltrated from their environment, pay to make sure they don't get leaked onto other types of extortion involving things like distributed denial of service. I mean, DDoS is back from the late 90s to be something that's on vogue again. We're seeing some claims of large volume DDoS is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 terabyte per second, which is just huge. And that's sustained. It's back to a point where even if you have a really solid DDoS defense in place, that's very hard to cope with.
What about long cycle attacks? Did we see a further increase in those? I think I know the answer to this one, but can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, gone are the days where the attack would just take a couple seconds, couple nanoseconds, and live entirely within one executable. Attacks now largely involve some sort of initial access and then some reconnaissance phase that can last for days, weeks. Sometimes we're seeing months where the attacker is reconnoitering the entirety of the environment, learning things about the software development lifecycle, learning things about where the crown jewels are, the business processes, finding out exactly what to exfiltrate, what would be of most value, how to exfiltrate it to get around all the DLP solutions, and when to strike with the full extortion scheme, whether they want to include a ransomware encryption or if they want to just stick with the exfiltration of files.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. And thank you to everyone. A nearly perfect score. Adam, a little bit skewed with you pulling in one from another year, but I think we'll give everyone that. All right, shifting gears from what's happened to what's coming. I think we all know this was a pretty tumultuous year for cybersecurity, from the Colonial Pipeline attack, which, as I'm sure many of you know, resulted in fuel shortages across much of the East Coast, to the devastating breach on Microsoft Exchange. But I think what everyone is here for is to better understand what the next year will look like and how they can better prepare for that. So again, our experts have laid out 2 predictions each. We're going to spend the majority of the rest of the session walking through those and getting everyone's take on that. Adam, let's start with you. Your first prediction is that more source code gets leaked, meaning more supply chain attacks. What's leading you to believe this is on the horizon?
I think when you look at some of the supply chain attacks that we all know, name brands like SolarWinds and Kaseya, one of the fallouts of those attacks is that the institutions they hit, may get access to things like source code, right? And in the case of Microsoft, who was hit by, the Sunburst attack, they, had mentioned that there was potentially views on source code for things like Azure, Exchange, and Intune, right? And as we saw, following that, Exchange Hacknium remote code execution vulnerabilities, we didn't just see one. We saw 4, I think 2 or 3 already, and a 4th likely, in terms of theoretical attacks that then became patches that you had to do so that people wouldn't log into your email server and use that as a beachhead into your environment. And so as you start to see the success of analyzing the source code, turning into more 0 days, turning into more successful attacks, I feel like we're just going to see more of these for different vendors, right? So as you see takeovers for things like SolarWinds or Kaseya, and even Exchange, right? I think we're going to continue to see those because they're incredibly successful, incredibly hard to stop. And frankly, when you get the source code to something, you have a pretty unfair advantage now because you can spend a lot of time researching and building different attacks against it that you're just are going to go undetected for a pretty long time.
Sean, thinking in the head of the adversary, I'm not saying that you are one, but you are an expert. What's your take on this?
Yeah, the Exchange case is a really interesting one that Adam brings up. I mean, we kind of have 2 fronts there. The source code leaks, like Adam mentioned, and also there's a real furthering of public research available from great researchers like Orange Sci, for example, where they're considering Exchange just end-to-end as something that they're putting a lot of focus into. They're documenting a lot of different ways that people could get in, and they're taking tactics that might not be considered by most defensive structures. So it's really attacker advantage in a lot of these cases, where it's a matter of making sure that people are equipped to cope with what would happen with the Exchange compromise itself, as well as the next stepping stones that happen after that.
Thanks, Sean. Moving into our next prediction, Jen, you spoke last year about your prediction around the traditional SOC is dead. This year, you foresee a complete reformation of the Security Operations Center. What does this look like? What does it mean for all of the IT and security leaders on the line?
Yeah, it is, kind of at face value an evolution of the previous hit, but it's worth calling out because it's coming from both the place of opportunity, but also requirement. So the opportunity first is that evolution from, with the traditional SOC being dead, those leaders of the SOCs are now in the position with those kind of floodgates being open to be able to seek out opportunities for optimization in ways they may not have considered before when they were bound by those traditional structures. So I think there's great opportunity there that leaders are going to be seeking out, I think, over the next year to make some beneficial changes. And if they're not, they should be. So speaking to the requirement, there's a few different factors here. One, security is no longer a problem that you can throw people at, right? Those security operations centers are designed to deal with quantity. And, historically, when people talk about their security operations center, they talk about it in the frame of like the number of people they have. And that's proving to be less and less effective because if you were to continue across the same method of like dealing with these alerts and stuff that are coming out, there's not enough people to deal with that. So, and second, the answer to those alerts is this evolution of machine learning and AI, where these decreased alerts, increased signal to noise ratio. And when you couple that with the speed at which the attackers can move today, you're going to need a security operations center that looks very different. You're looking at highly skilled people who are available on the front line to deal very, very rapidly with complex attacks. And you cannot do that with the existing structures of Security Operations Center. And then the other part of it is that it is no longer just a problem for security professionals either. So, security has long been a data problem, and that, of course, is only getting bigger. So it's really about understanding that data. And in order to evolve your MLAI, in order to actually take your Security Operations Center to the next level, you have to start looking at a broader diversity of skill sets to bring into the SOC, and that's with the advent of that diversity of skill sets coming into the SOC, how they actually work together, how you communicate together, all of those processes would have to be completely changed so that it can be fully optimized. So I think that the complete reformation of the Security Operations Center is, yes, in part an evolution of what has come in the last year, but I actually think the requirement is there and that security vendors really need to be on top of that in order to be able to keep up.
Thanks, Jen. You talked a lot about the data problem and the role that AI and ML are and will continue to play in informing this shift in how the SOC operates. Sean, I want to go over to you. As a security engineer, you're behind the scenes working with our data science team here and really thinking about this data problem. How do you see this shift happening on your side of the business and impacting how you do your job?
Really, I think the days of trying to solve this with even the best humans on the planet are just gone. The attacker gets to choose when they attack, where they attack, what they attack. Not only can they choose the most inconvenient time, they can pick some piece of technology that was just lost and not properly installed. It isn't just a data problem. It's a data problem that has complexities in terms of how it's interwoven with human processes, and the attackers will understand this in a lot of cases. To be able to solve this well, it's a matter of making sure that it isn't just standing up the traditional ML tree type structure where you're trying to solve for let's just detect one executable that happens to be bad based upon some tree structure that we would have stood up a decade ago or whatever. We need to process the data going back days and weeks to handle the long cycle attacks. We need to interlace that with proper augmentation of humans in the SOC, in other institutions, like whoever would be handling backup tapes and the like.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to stick with you. Your first prediction is that we're going to witness an increase in multi-level extortion schemes that evolve from ransomware. What's contributing to this increase? How are the adversaries thinking about this? How should people on the line be thinking about this?
Yeah, so I mean, what we're dealing with here is financial reward actors. These people are largely financially motivated. In some cases, they're financially motivated, but backed by nation states or large actor groups. But in any case, these financial reward actors are very well resourced and very good at their craft at this point. They've had years to hone it. They've had large resourcing structures. They've had altercations with large defensive structures, police agencies and the like from multiple nations. They know how to be resilient. They know how to handle their environment. The other thing that we're seeing is geopolitical initiatives and legislative changes that's going to change the victim's response. Well, that's going to cause them to change their tactics. We see talk about legislating ransomware disclosures and the like, and we're going to see that this cause the attackers to move to additional monetization schemes to accommodate this legislation. We're also going to see the attackers become more robustly use their acquired data. One of the next phases I see coming is the extortion schemes are going to do things like targeting the victim's customers and employees directly. So during the data warehousing and exfiltration phase of a second-tier ransom attack like we see now, we're going to see the attackers take the time to figure out what's in the data archive they have and make sure they have the things that allow them to go after the employees through personal healthcare records, HR records, things that would influence the customers or perhaps proprietary information on the customers themselves.
Adam, you're on the front lines talking to customers all the time. What would your advice be to everyone on the phone on how to better prepare for this? Should they pay if this happens?
I mean, you certainly want to put yourself in a position not to pay. I think when you think about the stress of these situations, immediately people start doing the business case on whether payment will get them their systems back, whether it will get them data that they believe they've lost back, right? And so a lot of this is preparing for these nightmare scenarios and making sure that, when we say crown jewels, we mean, your customer database or that file system that you rely on to do your work every day that has customer information, PII, other things in it. Certainly our customers, need a service. This may be selfish. I provide and the team provides in the VCSO where we go through tabletop exercises to simulate exactly this, to prepare you for this eventuality. Multi-level extortion techniques are what they sound like. Phone calls to your CFO threatening them, phone calls to your customers, emails to your customers, right? It gets ugly because they're hoping that you cry uncle and pay, whether it's restoring encrypted software or frankly just manipulating you into paying, right? And no honor among thieves, right? You pay, you may not get the encryption keys and get full restoration of your application back. That may not be the answer to the problem. And you need to pay before those things come true. You can also have these, they let you test it ideas, but frankly, how can you do that when they're saying, we'll delete your data that we've got, right? So we won't embarrass you. How do we know that's the case, right? And I don't believe that, a lot of this can be taken to people's words. I think you have to prepare for it, and that's what we advise people to do.
We do advise that. Thanks, Adam. Let's talk about your second prediction, that cyber insurance will become a luxury for the rich. I've been hearing and reading and seeing a lot of chatter recently around this, specifically around how premiums are an all-time high. What's going on here? What's going to change over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think one of the things is when you think about a luxury for the rich, it's like, when are you priced out of the market, right? I think people now would accept that it's expensive. Certainly, is it the reason inflation? No, right? I don't want to offend any actuaries who work for insurance companies by oversimplifying this, but loss ratios are how you calculate the cost of premiums for things like car insurance or health insurance or whatever it is, right? And so when you try to take those costs and you put it into practice, it kind of looks like this: we pay $1, and then if we have to pay out $1, then we have a loss ratio of 100%, right? We lost all the money we got, so we have to raise the premiums for this to be a viable business. And when you look at cyber insurance, it's obviously got a 100%, a 2x, sometimes 4x multiplier in terms of what those premiums cost last year and this year, right? So those are because of really obvious reasons, I think, for most people. The payouts have doubled from 140,000 on average to around 350. The number of premium increases has been year over year because of a loss ratio that's increased 25%. So for the $1 that goes out, it's now 75 cents, right? That means that we're almost 75% at a 75% loss ratio right now. So I think that there's two things that happen. One, you obviously see the premium increase, but you also see a lot more scrutiny. You have to harden yourself against the liability. So what the insurance companies do is they really create these long, very specific questionnaires where a couple of years ago you'd just be like, oh, I use an antivirus and no, I've never been hacked, and here's my InfoSec policy. Please give me cyber insurance. And now I've seen questionnaires that are 86 questions long with evidence that requires you to submit the kind of next-gen antivirus you have, and certain brands are not accepted. And so you have this scrutiny that I think also requires that you're using premium software. You've deployed premium processes from your SOC to review logs and things like that. And otherwise you don't qualify for the policy, right? And that means that everything gets more expensive. And that's what makes it the luxury for the rich, is you have to implement a lot of expensive processes different than you did before. It's harder to get cyber insurance, and therefore it won't be there for everybody.
So with all of that in mind, what would you tell a company to better arm themselves during the insurance selection process? Maybe somebody on the line is kicking this off for next year. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional advice still stands, right? Shop the deal. There's a lot of insurance providers out there. Some of them are a little more sophisticated than others, right? They may have the right questions to ask. They may give you premium deductions for the kind of coverage that you need, allow you to, exchange ideas on what they pay out on. Certainly, maybe their questions would allow a little bit of leniency or a variance and things like that. So I think shopping the deal will make sure that you can go to multiple places to try to get your insurance, which honestly will give you better options. But you have to do what they say. I don't think there's a lot of ways around this. When you look at the policies now and the questions that they're asking, you got to do the work, right? It's some things that just are too much liability to cover, right? You can't drive a 1975 car that catches on fire every 2 hours, or a race. You can't drive an F1 car, down the highway and expect that somebody's going to insure you for that, right? There's a reasonability clause here, and what they're asking for typically is reasonable. If you're talking about it against the adversary, it may seem unreasonable because it sounds like a lot of process you don't have, but that's what covers you for it. So
thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
Good advice. Jen, you're up next. My next victim. Talk to us about the great retention versus the great resignation of IT staff. What does this look like to you? How should everyone on the line be thinking about this going into 2022?
Yeah. So if we talk about security and IT staff for a second, there's a lot of assumptions around these professions. There's an assumption that there's a shortage. There's an assumption that, there's a high burnout rate and that you will always have a high attrition rate. There'll be a revolving door. They won't hang around too long. There's an assumption that the comp is high, that there's a high barrier of entry to the profession, and that the work-life balance is terrible. And fundamentally, we kind of disagree with most of those assumptions, right? And the problem is with making those assumptions, with naming them as being truths, is that people feel like they can just accept it and then, kind of move on. Now, we've, over the last couple of years, tried to really turn that around and start looking at the retention of security staff as being something that is very important, and how you do that, and how you do that in a meaningful way, right? And it's not just about paying them a lot and then, having them put up with whatever you throw at them, but it's about fundamentally treating them as human beings with whole lives and trying to create a good, work-life quality that everybody is entitled to. And while we were doing it, we've seen some rumblings across, maybe a couple of other organizations who are also starting to challenge some of those realities and seeing some successes in the retention of security staff. Now, normally those kind of changes would happen very slowly, right? And so maybe one or two companies start it, and then maybe it spreads, and then eventually it becomes something that is becomes a requirement for the job. But, in our workforce globally, at least for the last, 20, maybe even, kind of 50 years, there's, the power has always been with the employer. So a lot of the times the employer is setting, the boundaries on that. Enter the Great Resignation. Now, I again disagree with kind of naming this, because I think by companies naming this the Great Resignation, that they are sitting back and accepting that it's going to happen. But I actually think that this Great Resignation is accelerating this reckoning, for employers. And that companies are now waking up to the fact that there are other methods of retaining staff, and that need time, they need investment. You need to, sit with your employees. You need to understand what they actually want and need from their jobs and their careers, and then actually doing those things. And so I really think that a better naming for this is potentially the Great, retention, or, some people are calling it the Great Reshuffle of 2021, 2022. And we're seeing a couple of other companies talk about it as well. CEOs of Microsoft and LinkedIn came out this week and also talked about reshuffling employees. But what I predict for 2022 is that we'll see a lot more companies turning around and starting to invest more heavily, into retaining staff in a meaningful way. Because right now, the power has switched to workers for the first time in a really long time, in probably decades. And I think employers are starting to realize that this, and are going to start making the necessary changes, and whether it can curb the tide for some, I think it remains to be seen. But I see that prediction for 2022.
Well, I know we're focused on the security and IT side of the business today, but there's no doubt that this is happening across the entirety of organizations. Before I get some of the other panelists' thoughts on this, what does work-life balance look like to you? What are the top things that the SOC threat hunters employees are asking for or even demanding?
A lot of it is about flexibility, and in order to stave off burnout as well, the ability to turn off. And the flexibility really means, getting the kind of entitlements that a lot of other employees and companies get, right? Being able to have a flexibility of doing their work when it needs to be done, focusing on outputs rather than, time in front of a screen. And, we can enable that in a lot of ways with technology, right? But the power to be able to switch off, I think, is something that's not talked about as much, but actually has a much bigger impact. Developing teams to be able to trust each other, that if they are on vacation or they're just off today or they're off that evening, that they do genuinely feel like they can walk away from their computer and think about something else until the next time they're back at work. That's one of the biggest things we hear about, is even with an amplitude of vacation and, kind of being well paid and other benefits, if they don't feel that they can mentally switch off from work in their downtime, that accelerates burnout for them.
Thanks, Jen. I will say we are pretty lucky at Axero. This is something that's ingrained in our culture, I think. And, given our ability to move quick and be agile, it does allow us to really address these issues head on and in collaboration with, other leaders across the business, which is great. Sean, you've had some former lives at larger organizations. What are some of the successful strategies you've seen implemented to handle this?
Yeah, I mean, Jen brings up some really good points there in terms of ensuring the quality of life while maintaining high quality SOC performance. It's a really neat domain for us to be applying this in, to be frank. I mean, this isn't something like it's part of a software delivery lifecycle or something like that. We have a situation here where it's very combative. The attackers get to choose when, where, and how to attack. We're dealing with live human attackers that, if there is any gap introduced by a new policy change, a new cultural change, anything like that, they're going to try to find it and they're going to exploit it. In terms of some of the things that I've seen employed in the past, I mean, I've had the fortunate experience of working at a number of really cool startups in the security space. And a few of the different things employed range from giving people very specific guidelines whereby once you start on a threat, you continue on it until it's done. And I mean, that's great in terms of personal development and things like that. But it also means that a lot of times when you start on an attack, you're seeing the sun go down and then come up the next day and you're still looking at the event. I mean, it goes into things like necessity, or maybe laziness is a mother of all inventions here, whereby it's sure a motivator to seek out things like automation pipelines and artificial intelligence to be able to augment a lot of this analysis that's happening. In terms of social structures, it's really a matter of making sure that there's deep trust between team members. People can really understand each other's expertise, their growth paths, their ability to handle situations, and know enough about people's personal lives to be able to know that it's time to hand things off at whatever time that was agreed on, irrelevant of how things are, and make sure that the processes and agreements are in place well ahead of time and well vetted and well tested against legitimate attacks, to make sure that everybody can know that when they're done with an event, they're done with the event, and the event itself won't suffer. So it's a matter of making sure that there's people and processes and trust in place, as well as making sure that there's technology in the back end to make sure that everything moves smoothly, irrelevant of the nature of the attack.
Sean, Jen, both of you, I could not agree with you more. This one in particular, I look forward to seeing how companies of all sizes attack this head on over the next year. With that and attacks, Sean, over to you for the last one. Your prediction is that attacks are going to become more personalized. What does this mean? How does this change how the folks on the line are currently preparing and defending themselves? And what can we do to better prepare and defend ourselves moving into 2022?
Yeah, I see a great deal of personalization in the attacks, as well as specialization within the attackers occurring. We're already seeing some level of attacker specialization and making use of specialized marketplaces. I see this really going full throttle, really hitting the afterburners here. Attackers that are wanting to specialize in things like getting the initial foothold into a victim environment can do so. And I see that their marketplaces for the initial access, brokers and so on in the underground becoming much better fleshed out. I mean, there's some of this now, but it's going to move to a point where attackers can pick whatever segment of the attack they want. Even if they want to do nothing but negotiate the ransom, they're able to do that and safely hide within the underground marketplaces. So what I see coming out of this is that it's kind of an unfortunate situation, but I see that this means that we will move farther from whoever is vulnerable to a new attack victimhood to the victim being matched with their ideal worst attacker. And this will be the case for most attacks. Instead of a random threat actor infiltrating a company and holding its files for ransom and then seeing what comes from that, we're going to see attackers acquiring access to a specific organization and already having a ready access to a buyer that wants that information. So it's going to be a espionage type thing where people already have a competing buyer that will compete with the rightful owner of the acquired property. and they're haggling back and forth and escalating the price along the way. And there's also going to be a lot of issues around victim attack or trust, if you will, to make sure that they're only selling it back to the original owners as opposed to sharing it broadly. I also think that we're going to see a lot of personalization and specialization in that the attacks are going to be against proprietary business software. Let's just take, for an example, a company that's offering a custom application that exists as an AWS dashboard that's fed by some mobile application. We can expect that this app itself is going to be targeted such that that compromise will compromise each of the users, each of the customers of that app. We've seen some of this in things like the Kaseya attack, where the Kaseya RMM software was used to exploit the customers of Kaseya. I mean, that was kind of a one-off situation, but I think the days of companies being able to treat their proprietary in-house software as a black box that is sufficiently obscure and unknown to be not require extensive defense are just gone. I think the attackers are getting much more comfortable with their long cycle attacks. We're seeing them spend weeks or months in victim environments, and along the way, they're becoming comfortable with things like software development life cycles. They're becoming comfortable with things like even naming conventions within variables. We're seeing in some of the attacks, for example, with the SolarWinds attack, you see that the backdoor introduced followed a lot of naming conventions that existed within that software. And I suspect that along the way with these long cycle attacks, the attackers are going to see how to get into things like bug bounty warehouses. So they'll see all the bugs and vulnerabilities found in proprietary software by just the general public. So they have a huge starting point. They'll know how the bugs fixes are prioritized, what the release track is like, and know when, where, and how to strike.
They're going deep. We've been personalizing things in marketing for years to be more effective. So they're taking one from our books to be more effective. Thanks to the three of you. I really appreciate you walking us through that. I will say I hope that some of these more business disrupting predictions don't come true. You guys have a pretty good track record. And I hope that everyone on the line found these insights and the action steps valuable. Before we wrap up with some resources and Q&A, I want to put it back to each of the panelists to lay out what is your number one tip for how small and mid-sized organizations can prepare for 2022. Adam, let's go with you.
Yeah, if you've talked to me before in VCSO capacity or read any of the blogs, where you know exactly what I'm going to say, right? You got to make if there's a great reorg that needs to happen in terms of our thinking about personnel, we need to think about the personnel on the other side too, right? We have to make the attacker's life as bad as we can, and the things that make them terrible and take a long time to work are hardening your operating system, right? So we've included some attachments here at the end that you can get on exactly what I'm talking about: host firewalls, software restriction policies, restricted groups, things your Windows person will understand. Of course, hardening your system, right? Don't just go with out of the box, right? Go with a good benchmark. So hardening your cloud. We wrote a great white paper on this, but certainly things like CIS benchmarks will walk you through exactly what settings to put in once you get and buy new software to make sure that it's up to date. And then we wrote a great article about how to survive supply chain attack like SolarWinds. Spoiler alert, there's a lot you can do with next gen software and machine learning and AI to defend against this stuff, but there's other things you want to try to practice to make sure you stay ahead of it. So that's my handoff is hardening, endpoint, network, cloud.
Perfect. Jen.
Yeah, my advice would be to look for those optimization opportunities in your teams, but take the time to genuinely engage with them and not to dismiss necessarily out of hand some of the requests and concerns, right? Really drill into the why behind it. Look for opportunities to make it easy for them to stay with you and make it easy for them to be high performers.
I think that, again, applies to the whole organization too, but obviously we're focused on that today. Last but not least, again, Sean.
Yeah, I think one of the factors to take into account here is to make sure that all incident response procedures extend both upstream and downstream in your supply chain. So there's a blog that we link to at the end of this that talks about the remote monitoring and management, the RMM aspects of this. But This has to do with the making sure that if there is an incident, how do you make sure that it's contained and isolated from any of your customers, from any of your partners? How is an attack against one of your suppliers or partners upstream going to impact you? And assuming that can no longer be trusted, can you still function? This is one of the things that we see the attackers going after, and hopefully we can help everybody get in front of this to minimize it as much as possible.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. I'm looking forward to reconvening at the end of next year to see how this all unfolds. All right, so resources have come up a few times. I will say the panelists just did an extremely great marketing job there with some of those resources on the last one. We've highlighted 3 key ones for you to take away from today's conversation. If you click on the attachments tab below, you'll find first a piece on remote monitoring and management and advice on how to reduce your attack surface. Second, we have our incident response guide. I believe, Adam, you were a great contributor to this, so something to help with your foundation and strategy here. And then last is our a longer piece on the hyperscale SOC. We've got contributions in this from leaders across our business, including all of our panelists from today. As we mentioned before, there's a host of other, CXO insights reports, some white papers, we've got guides, we've got templates on the axio.ai website. If you just head over to the resources and blog section, you can search through there to find what you want, or of course, always reach out and we're happy to discuss further. All right, now moving into questions. If anyone has any additional questions that are not already in there, please feel free to submit them at any time. All right, first up. I knew cyber insurance would be a good one. What if I don't qualify for cyber insurance? Adam.
It's a measuring stick. It probably means that you are not doing enough to secure your business against the kinds of things that the adversary is up to. These practices are not made in a bubble. They are not, misunderstood as effective against the attacker. I'm going to say most of the policies will usually include things that, frankly, only have a precedent for blocking things that lead to things like ransomware. So if you're having a problem with understanding why your passwords are not enough or logging should be done, it's just a big part of not only preventing an attack from coming, but also if one does, minimizing material damage there, which obviously minimizes the downtime and payout. So that's where those questions come from. I think that you do have to ask yourself, why don't you have the resources potentially to deal with what's being asked of you? And there's a lot of ways to hack that as well, right? There's a lot of ways to consolidate those costs. You don't just simply have to go and buy the most expensive enterprise product to do the job. Sometimes those things can be done with tools you already have.
Great. As I mentioned before, if we don't get to your question, or if you have further follow-up questions, feel free to reach out at info@axio.ai, and somebody on the line here or another one of our team members will get back to you to set up some time to chat further. All right. Where do we want to go? What do you do if you are in an extortion scheme? What are the pathways forward? I'm gonna pick on you, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional argument here is pay or don't pay. Of course, we recommend that people don't pay. I mean, even when you pay, there's no guarantee that you ever get your data back, your files back, your assets back. But it's ultimately a choice that comes down to a lot of different factors. But always explore other avenues. So there's many public projects where people will pick apart specific strains of ransomware, find the vulnerability, the problems with the encryption structure that they use, and create decryptors for specific versions or just broadly whole families. There's even been cases where there's been infighting within a what do you want to call it, ransomware gang, where they've leaked their confidential keys, and you can just decrypt everything that occurs after that. So even if you can't decrypt on that day, you might be able to in the future. There's also things like many copies of ransomware. They do a lot of this for speed reasons. I mean, they don't want to spend all day encrypting your files. They want to destroy as many of them as they can as quickly as possible. So one of the optimizations that a lot of them will do is they'll encrypt a fragment of each file and then move to the next file. Now, in some cases, that's equivalent to destroying the file. If you have a deeply compressed file or encrypted file and you encrypt a portion of it, you're probably not going to get the rest back, as long as that portion is sufficiently large, of course. But in some cases, in the case of an XML file or something like that, when it blows away a component of a file, you have the rest of the file there. So there's still some recovery avenues that can be done by mechanisms of not paying, not recovering. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. I have another one for you, Sean. So MIT Technology Review published an article last week highlighting a, quote, harvest now and decrypt later strategy where encrypted data is stolen in the hopes it can be decrypted in a decade. Do you see more data exfiltration with encrypted data in 2022?
Yeah, for sure. I see a lot of attackers are going to be taking a strategy like this. There's a lot of encryption at rest schemes that companies are using to protect their data. Now, theoretically, there's no good way of an attacker getting access to the clear text that's inside of those encrypted files, but that isn't going to stop a lot of them from trying. Where there's a will, there's a way. In some cases, they're going to exfiltrate the encrypted file anyway in hopes of it having some asset value or them being able to recover some fraction of it in the future. And who knows, there might be a way that they're leaking the key or some other specific attack that they're using against that data, whether it be an implementation one or a key handling one or something like that. I also see things where, like I just finished talking about, where there's some benefits to the victim of an encryption scheme being able to just wait until they can find a good way of managing to decrypt those files.
Thanks, Sean. Adam, it is actually, you know what? I'm going to put this to both. I'd like to get Adam and Jen's perspective on this. It is said that there aren't enough cybersecurity experts and people to hire. Do you agree? And how important is senior C-suite management versus actual field experts?
Yeah, I think obviously when you think about roles internal to the organization and roles that are outsourced, right, a lot of people look at business cases around which roles are more effective at finding and stopping the adversary. They're going to have a greater impact on your risk overall. The science of saying, okay, well, I've got a well-commissioned privacy officer that's necessary for a lot of regulation. They have to have buy-in from senior management. You have to have, POAMs, right? Projects, budget, timeline to implement some of these cyber practices. And depending on your industry, you usually do have to have executive buy-in labeled and named and ready to commit to cyber. And they have to show that they can resource thing in what we call the field or the technical roles that are involved. But certainly a marriage between InfoSec and frameworks and guidelines to staff and build your cybersecurity teams and, field tech that has the technical skills to enable and configure technology or monitor or something like that are both necessary, and they're both mandated in order to sort of stop these things, right? Maybe for different reasons, right? Finding and stopping the latest ransomware versus, making sure you don't have a liability and know what the breach office phone number is two different jobs. Both can be outsourced, and both are, potentially going to have dividends either in or out of the company full time, and depending on your size and your config, right? So, I wouldn't speak to which one is right for everyone, but pass it over to Jen in terms of the labor config of it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because, we're talking about the cybersecurity labor shortage now for, as long as we've conceptualized cybersecurity. But we actually do have, an increase in programs and self-certifications. It's known as one that you don't necessarily need formal education for. You've got enterprise companies, having no experience necessary entry-level training programs. So, the question is, why do we still have a labor shortage? And I think that's really the question that we need to tackle and come at it from that angle. Because the reality is there's a high burnout rate. So the bigger question is, yes, we have a shortage. Yes, we've done everything, or there's a lot happening now to get people trained into these roles. And it's very attractive to people, right? Because of the, the traditionally high compensation of it. But we also now need to work on how we actually keep people in those positions. So we're back to retention again. How do we actually keep people in the profession and have them not burn out after 5 years?
Next up, is X0 complementary or alternative to cloud-native web application firewall and API protection and container security and policy management platforms? Adam, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you buy those tools when you make software that's deployed in the cloud, but a lot of people just put their workloads up there, right? It's for a lot of people, their cloud is just their data center, and they're hosting what we call cloud workloads, and you protect a lot of them the same way, right? You have to monitor the logs from them. You got to put endpoint agents on them because there's still a whole server. So you are going to be complementary to a lot of things that can even happen in SaaS tools, right? If you buy Office 365, it's cloud software, right? And the concept is you have to monitor it for things like account takeover, malicious admin activity, very different than you do a web application firewall, which is very closely aligned to, for those who know it, OWASP, right? The Open Web Application Security Project, and source code flaws that your application hasn't necessarily coded to prevent, right? Form control exploits and that kind of thing. So it's certainly complementary to detect and respond to a wide variety of the hypervisor, the infrastructure, the operating system attacks that exist in the cloud, and the SaaS apps that you've bought. Everything from Amazon to Salesforce to Office 365 has a large component of that. That's arguably the layer you would protect against first, because those are the ones that the attacker knows about most. Sean had some great points about supply chain and saying don't leave your lesser known vendors or off the shelf software exploitable. Thinking that the obfuscation, the idea that nobody knows what it is going to prevent them from getting in there. There are known techniques for all of those things, and you should definitely prevent against them. But the wider, more, the one that's going to get them bigger bang for their buck is going after known attacks across lots of hypervisors. It's every Exchange and not just the web app that you made on top of Exchange, or the plugin or something that has its own source code running in a Lambda function somewhere. So I would say it's definitely complementary. It's probably something you would want to do first just because of the severity and impact, the likelihood and impact of the other attacks.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. All right, we are close to the top of the hour. Before we all hop off, please take some time to rate us. We want to make sure that these are valuable conversations for you. If you have any additional feedback, we always love to hear that. And we really appreciate you spending the last 57 minutes with us. As I mentioned before, feel free to reach out to info@x0.ai with any additional questions. And we look forward to hosting you again soon. Thanks, everyone.